Hello again. This is Grant Swartzwelder. I'm your host today for another episode of The Grown-Up Table, conversations about life and character. You know, when something terrible hits your life, you might get a phone call in the middle of the night hearing bad news, or you watch the TV and see some type of a mass casualty. You tend to resort to the one thing that you're kind of programmed to do. You're either asking people to pray for you, or you pray for yourself and for the recovery of those individuals. That is something in our DNA that's ancient, that's just so human. But there's a quiet part of that I want to talk about, and that's what we're going to be doing today. Talking about whether prayer is an action or an avoidance. Is prayer enough to get you through that issue or to help society get through with that? So to address that topic, we're very fortunate to have a wonderful speaker, the Reverend Dr. Christopher Girata, who is, we've been having a conversation about how to pronounce his name. I think I did it close, or he's at least nice enough to say that that's okay.
Absolutely.
He's the 8th rector of the St. Michael's and All Angels Episcopal Church here in Dallas, a wonderful theologian, very well respected in the Episcopal Church, has more degrees than I can count on, most notable doctorate from Duke, a lot of other churches or other universities too, but I have found him to be, and for full disclosure, this is where I go to church as well, but I find him very intellectual, but very caring and very knowledgeable about the human emotions and beliefs. So I think he's a fabulous one to talk to about this. So after sitting at the table with that, I'd like to turn it over to you, Chris, and just answer that question. Is prayer an action, or is it an avoidance of action?
Well, first, thank you for having me, Grant. It's a pleasure to be here, and very kind introduction. This is a really important question because I think that most people experience trauma and crisis in the world multiple times in their lives. And we are often faced with people who are trying to be thoughtful, trying to be careful, and they issue thoughts and prayers. You know, our thoughts and prayers are with you. I'm praying for you. Mm-hmm. That kind of, as you said, rolls off our tongue. It's part of our conditioning. Easy. Absolutely. And I think the question of what is prayer is really important. And over the years, when I have done Bible studies and other kinds of small groups, that simple question, what is prayer, can captivate for hours, days, weeks at a time, because everyone has been conditioned to think that prayer is sort of a give and take. You give a certain kind of prayer. You say the right words at the right time with the right emotions, and then you get the thing that you're asking for. And in Scripture, we see that Jesus tells his followers, ask for what you want. Like, ask, and it will be given to you. Like, we see Jesus say that to his followers. And so I've always been a proponent of prayer as an ask. Do not be afraid to make an ask. But your question's a bit more specific. Is prayer an action?
Is that the end of the game, or should there be more, or is it a way to avoid the game?
So I want to take this in two parts.
Please.
The first part is, what is love? We as Christians, as people who commit to following Jesus, we are the ones who say that God is love and that we are to love God and love our neighbor as ourselves. Excellent. And that is the foundation of what it means to be Christian, even though the world may have taken Christianity in many different other directions. It really boils down to love God, love your neighbor. Yes. Love, although yes, an important emotion, is absolutely meant to be an action as a Christian. And so loving as a feeling for your neighbors, that's not enough. Jesus does not speak of love as just feeling love for other people. Jesus says, love your neighbor. And what Jesus wants is you to take an action for your neighbor, to actually do something to benefit your neighbor. So holding that in mind, then we ask the question, what is prayer?
Right.
Prayer is fundamentally about the person who is praying. When we pray, we are shaping our own identities. We are not, as some people think, informing God of something he doesn't already know. Like, God's got it. So that your loved one has a bad diagnosis, or that there is a natural disaster in your community, or on and on. It's not like God doesn't know that is happening. And so we need to correct a common misunderstanding that prayer is somehow informing God of a problem in order for God to then step in and do something about it. That's not what prayer is really about.
Okay.
Prayer is actually about who we are and our willingness to understand that we are both to love in action our neighbors and that we are not in control. And that lack of control, that is so tough, especially for people like us who have been pretty good at life. I mean, we are comfortable. We are people who are well educated. We live a very kind of strong, clear life. We like to think we have a lot more control than we do, and we have built systems around us to confirm the control we want to have, even though we don't really have it. And for us to give over that sense of control in prayer is actually a humbling experience that is good for our souls. And it's through prayer that we should actually center ourselves on what is our greatest calling in order then to take action.
So are you not making my argument that prayer in a way is just a refuge for that individual to be able to handle their emotions? And so it's just a very kind of isolating and kind of a very self-serving action.
No.
Okay.
So prayer can be done individually, of course.
Sure.
And I think if it's done individually and separately from the world around us, then it could become what you're describing, where it is almost a self-centeredness.
You don't think society as a whole, that's how they treat prayer?
So here's where I think we differ. Prayer may begin individually,
Okay.
but prayer as its greatest expression is done in community. We should be doing prayer together. So to be specific about your question, when people offer their thoughts and prayers, that's cheap. That is saying something that I guess fills the void of uncertainty at a moment when you can't say anything better.
That's like in a mass casualty. You always have the sheriff or the FEMA person saying, we just need your prayers. To me, that seems cheap also. That's like, it's a toss-in line that you just do because it's written in Public Relations 101.
I think that in general, our world misunderstands prayer. And so when someone like that says, we need your prayers, they are misunderstanding what prayer is actually meant to do. Because prayer is actually meant to be the starting place of acts of love. That's how it should flow. Now, if they understood that prayers are meant to create acts of love, then I think saying we need your prayers would be fine. I don't think that's how most people are understanding prayer when they say that. But if you look at some movements over our history, especially in the last, say, century, prayer was critically important to motivating the identities and the actions of communities to try to make the world a better place. When people prayed together, they unified their desire for what was hopeful and what was better for the future. And then they were able to take action together. But it's because they anchored themselves and their community in prayer that allowed them to take the actions that ultimately created love, took acts of love out into the world to make the world better.
So when you say it's a community action, how does that manifest itself? That you hear this tragedy, whether it's individualized or society tragedy, how does that manifest itself?
So I like to always remind people that relationship with the divine, relationship with God, a good spiritual life is anchored in crisis. Now, crisis can be good or bad. A crisis could be a good crisis. You get a new job and you have to move to a new city, or you get married, or you have your first child, or some version of that. Good crises. Those are crises.
Sure.
Any first-time parent knows having a baby is a crisis. But it's a good crisis. And what it does is it shakes you and it changes you and it opens you up to being willing to do something different and new. Then, of course, there are bad crises. So a bad crisis could be a bad diagnosis, the loss of a loved one, the loss of a job, the loss of some kind of capacity or power, or it could, of course, be a community crisis, such as what we experienced last summer in the flooding in the Hill Country here in Texas.
Yes, sir.
And of course, globally, those are bad crises. One way or the other, a crisis, good or bad, is an opportunity for us to reevaluate who we are in our relationship to God, reevaluate who we are in a community sense in our relationship to God, and then make a good change. I like to say to my staff and anyone who listen, never let a good crisis go to waste. It's one of my favorite maxims, because a crisis is always an opportunity. And so for me as a church leader, I see community as being absolutely central to the way we respond to a crisis. So I think you're implying more the bad crisis. And so we can take sort of that negative bad crisis and say, when a bad thing happens, then what? And for me, and in my experience, and I would say that the Christian tradition holds that this is true pretty much through time, the first thing we should do is be together. And so we don't know exactly how to respond to a bad crisis in the moment. It's emotional. It can be overwhelming, especially take, for example, last summer. That kind of flooding that was so terrible, and the loss of life, especially the loss of children, absolutely tragic. No question.
Especially for this area, because almost everybody knew someone.
Everyone was touched in some way.
Right.
What should we do first? Gather, be together. Actually, do not go off alone, but come together in community. And then what do we do as a community? Oh, we should pray. And what that prayer is doing is reminding us of what we have forgotten because of the crisis. We know the truth. If you have committed yourself in some way to a good spiritual life, then although a crisis may throw you completely off the rails for a moment, bringing you back onto the rails is really what prayer can do. Reminding you of what you have forgotten because the crisis is so emotional. And once you're reminded of what the crisis made you forget for a moment, then the question becomes, now what do we do? And that prayer as a community can center our identity and create a unified purpose in order to respond to what the crisis is. Now, is that response going to fix the crisis? That's not what prayer is about. Prayer's
but
about—
it might start the process.
It's the action, right? It's putting love into action. And we can grow, we can learn, we can take action first and then realize maybe that wasn't the best thing to do. Let's try something else and continue to commit ourselves, because it's in that commitment, anchored in prayer, trying to act in love, that actually produces the hopefulness that we can build a better world. As a follower of Jesus, as we create identities, Christian identities, I think the very core of being a disciple is believing that hope wins, love wins, that none of the negative, none of the horrible tragedies, even death itself, does not win. And that hopefulness has to take some kind of shape. You have to put legs on it. You have to put that into action. And that's where the love in action actually begins to transform identities, both individual and communal, in order to actually make a good impact on the world.
Several things to unpack there, but let's jump back to one. As a man that has said more prayers than I could probably count on any number of hands, how should someone, and I can hear your point being prayer is individualized, blah, 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 all that, but how should someone approach praying for negative or positive? And I want to get back to the positive side because I hadn't thought about that part. But let's just talk about what should I be trying to achieve or say when I do pray?
I want to start with the idea that prayer is just a conversation.
Sure.
It is just communication. Oftentimes, people are introduced to prayers as beautiful poetry, and prayers can be beautiful poetry, but that can be very intimidating at the start. And so to begin—
I can honestly say none of my prayers sound as good as your prayers.
Well, but that's—
So that always hurts, and I know I lose God points because of that,
You
but
do
I'm
not.
hoping to overcome that.
So that's part of what I want you to know, is that every time you commit yourself to simply a conversation with God, that's all. Some people can be a bit more eloquent. Some people have more practice. Some people are trained up in different kinds of strategies for prayer. That's all nice.
They use polysyllable words.
Oh my goodness,
big
yes.
words that I
or
don't
they
understand.
rhyme, or it's
Yes.
beautiful turns of phrases. I'm no poet, but prayer first and foremost is a conversation. And so the most important thing is that you are vulnerable. You are confident enough and strong enough to be vulnerable, and that vulnerability then opens you up. Nothing you say is changing God's mind. Often we think of God as like a cosmic vending machine where like we want the thing in the machine. And so if we say the right prayer in the right way at the right time,
Sure.
we get the thing that we want. That's not how this works.
Back to my God points.
That's it.
Exactly.
So no God points.
Okay.
It's
Darn it.
about you.
Yep.
And it's about me. And it's about us as a community being willing to be vulnerable. And in a tragic crisis, that vulnerability can almost feel like it breaks you, because in the face of something so horrible, we all try to be strong. But what we have learned and what our tradition teaches us is that our hope is in God alone, that it's in Christ we gain our strength. And so for us to be vulnerable enough to say our strength is not in ourselves, our strength is in God, then we hand over the vulnerability and the weakness and the loss of control to God. And that's where we gain our true strength. And when we do that as a community, then the power of that within the community can be overwhelmingly good. It is beyond anything that we could hope or imagine. And so when communities do this right, they can become a force for incredible good.
So once I say a prayer, or we say it as a community, should there be expectations for the next step?
Absolutely. So a community that only gathers and prays, they're not really doing what they're called to do, which is one of the reasons why, I mean, specifically about our church, that's one of the reasons why we emphasize again and again and again the idea of service.
Right.
So yes, we gather to pray. Yes, we gather to learn, of course, but then we leave having prayed, having learned, having shaped our identities, having bound ourselves to one another and to God, and then we go out and we serve. And that service can look like anything that uses your gifts. We are all gifted in unique ways. And so some of us have the gifts that are all kind of back the house, preparatory, hardworking little,
Everyone has their own gift.
That's right. And then some of us have the gifts of we go out and we speak and we motivate and we encourage and that sort of stuff, and everything in between. All those gifts are necessary. And all of those gifts, if exercised together and in concert and in sync, that's when you create power in community. And we've seen that over time. Even in our own history in America, when movements are well coordinated and well synchronized, where people are confidently using the gifts they have in order to reach a shared purpose, that's when change is actually made.
In researching for this podcast, I came across a phrase called "action is a prayer of hands." And talking about how it's that prayer that will eventually cause the action, cause the hands, the gifts. It seems like that's what you're saying. That's
the way that I often say it is that actions shape habits, and habits shape identity.
okay.
And so
and
the
then
actions,
identity causes the actions later.
and it's cyclical. It can be
Okay.
very virtuous cycle.
Right.
The issue with simply saying actions shape habits, shape identity is unless you acknowledge that you are not the center of your world, then that entire loop becomes completely self-centered. If we actually anchor our identity in prayer, then what we're doing is we're opening ourselves up not only to each other as a community, but also to God. And that relationship to God, something beyond ourselves, that creates a strong sense of humility, and it creates a strong sense of vulnerability and generosity, where it's not just about us, it's about the whole, it's about the world, it's about all of humanity. Then, once we've done that in prayer, and we decide to go take actions, those actions will have shifted. We will take different actions because we have anchored ourselves together in prayer in the divine. And then those actions will be a bit more centered on what God would have us do, to then create habits that then create identity, that create this virtuous cycle. But it's not a cycle based on our wants alone. We have actually begun that cycle with the level of humility, knowing that we are not in charge, we are not in control, that we actually anchor our strength in God, and we are opening ourselves again and again and again to hear God's words to us, to feel God's little nudges to do or not to do certain things. And those God nudges over time actually make that cycle more and more virtuous, to the point where people who have been doing this for decades, now it's just completely automatic. They have created this sort of cycle for themselves that keep them so yoked to the community and to the divine that they don't have to think about it anymore. That has become their identity, and their actions evolve over time in a really healthy spiritual way.
That's fantastic. I want to go back to another point that you were talking about, because this podcast came about because of the mass casualties and the negative, but you brought up an interesting point about the positive side, the crisis through a baby being born, or and I don't know, not necessarily a crisis, but that's a change of life. And I thought that's an interesting point, that there might be the same need for prayer and action in the positives of birth, new job, whatever that might be. And could you address some of that? That's a fascinating thing that I always think of prayer with the negative, but you're making it sound like on the positive side, it's just as important.
Oh, I think it's absolutely just as important. You and I are both parents. I cannot think...
You better than me, but
no.
That we'll address that later.
You're a phase ahead of me, so there you go. I cannot think for myself of another experience in my life that has been more humbling than being a parent. That is scarier, that is more vulnerable, that puts you in touch with your lack of control as being a parent. And so to me, although it's a beautiful crisis, that's absolutely a moment when I wanted to pray more. I mean, I can remember the first time that my oldest was sick, and not like sniffles in the nose sick, but actually had croup, like real sick.
Sounded bad,
and
looked bad.
It's the first time in my life that I could not sleep overnight. And I remember being so undone, even though everyone was telling me he's going to be fine. Don't worry. I mean, it really is okay. This is not as bad as it sounds, way worse than it is. That didn't matter, because for me, I felt like I was completely vulnerable. I was powerless to be helpful to him. And that sort of stripped down emotional state is the sort of crisis I'm talking about, that can be a very good crisis for us if we are willing to then take that moment of vulnerability and then turn over to God. And thankfully, I had been trained to do that. I mean, that's part of why, again, speaking as a parent, I say to young parents all the time, just bring your child to church. It doesn't matter if you want to. It certainly doesn't matter if they want to. Like, that should never even be a question. People would say, like, my child really didn't want to come today. Does your child ever want to go to school? I mean, it seems to me crazy that you would ever take your child's opinion into consideration at all for that kind of stuff. But just bring your kid to church, because it's not about that specific day. What it's about is creating the habit, getting it deep down in their soul, into their bones, that when they have a crisis, good or bad, they then have that reflex to turn toward God, because that's actually what we're made for. We're made to be in relationship with God. We are created to be in relationship with the divine in that way. And if we have created the habit and created the systems within us that help us turn toward God in crisis, then good or bad, we actually create that anchor that then can sustain us beyond the crisis moment into those acts of love that then hopefully make a big positive impact in the world.
Yeah, I do see the consistency there about creating the habit, creating the kind of absorbing the process in so that you know how to respond.
And most people, especially in our community, really struggle with ever thinking they need that. Mm-hmm. Most will listen to that and say, that's nice. I mean, most people around here aren't going to say going to church and making that a habit is a bad thing. They're not, because culturally, we're not at that place yet. However, I think the majority would say, I don't really need that. Like, I'm okay. Things are fine. I don't really need. And that temptation toward self-centeredness in the purest sense, not in a bad way, but just focusing on self, relying and depending on self, that has been shaped for so many years. I mean, think about if you knew how to drive from here to your home and back, and then you had to take a different route, that different route might be interesting, but the next day you're going to go back to the same route again. Sure. Because it's ingrained in you and you've done it for so long and for so long. If you are, say, our age, and you then are asked to change a habit, that kind of change in habit is probably not going to work. I mean, statistically, it's really low. That success rate's going to be really low. If you are doing a habit setting in a toddler that then goes through the teen years into the young adult years, well, that habit is set pretty firmly. And it's much harder to break a habit later in life if it's been set from the beginning. The problem we have, especially in church culture right now, is that we've had multiple generations of people who have not just been taken to church. And so the habit of church, forget belief and doctrine and all of that sort of stuff, just the habit of it being an important part of your week, that is so far gone at this point that convincing adults to set that habit for their children is about the best thing we can do to try to fix the problem.
You just kind of skip the generation but I'm kidding a little bit on that.
I wasn't here for that generation, sorry.
But no, and that takes us to where one of the next topics I wanted, because at St. Michael's, there's a lot of successful people. A lot of my friends would be considered successful, but I wonder about how they look at prayer, and you're addressing it where a lot of them, my guess they don't pray because they're not trained to do that. Or if they do pray, back to my thesis, that are they just doing it to avoid making a decision or kind of, again, that refuge? So there's a couple of parts there.
Yeah, that's
and then I think the follow-on is, how do you teach an old dog a new trick?
Yeah.
And that's, I would think, very challenging.
It's the hardest thing. I think that there are a few different levels there of prayer. The first being those who pray and think that praying is enough, and have missed the idea that prayer is meant to lead to action. If we could just fix that, to say prayer is the starting place, it is not the end goal. It's how you anchor yourself. It's how you start before you decide how to take action. That, I think, would change for a lot of people. I do think there are a lot of people in our community who will pray at some point. Maybe it's not daily. Maybe it's not the kind of habit I wish they had. But prayer at some point, yeah, I think it's there. Maybe even if it's just very tiny prayers when things go wrong, at least prayer's kind of in their psyche in some way. If we could get it so that people understood prayer as the starting place to create a good action, man, I think that would change a lot of things. The second part of your question, though, I think is really important, which is, how do you even just get people to pray? Right. And so we've been tackling that in a number of different ways. Principally, and we were talking about this earlier, we seasonally do meditations that are led by our clergy, our priests, that are less than 10 minutes. And we have done almost 1,000 of those since COVID. It started as just a wonderful accident. I had it as one of those ideas where I said, what if we, as the priests, offered a 10 minutes or less meditation. We would do an opening prayer, do a reading, offer a meditation like 4 minutes, and then close with the Lord's Prayer and a final prayer. And people could just kind of do it on their way to work, or they could do it before they get out of bed, or whatever works for them before they go to sleep at night, any of that. We would kind of be their partner. We would be their friend who was helping them pray every day. And I said, let's start it in Lent in 2020. Okay. And so we started our recordings, we kicked it all off. And of course, a couple weeks into Lent in 2020, the entire world shut down for the pandemic.
Definitely.
And do you know what every one of our members had at home every day? One of our priests praying with them. In those early days of the pandemic, those prayers were there for them, already prepped. And it was this lifeline for the community. Well, so we recorded for Easter as well. And so we've continued doing that in 4 major seasons every single year, to the point now where we've done nearly 1,000 of these just in the last few years. And those are meant to be a gift, like it's your friend who reminds you, let's pray for 10 minutes. 10 minutes a day. We can do anything for 10 minutes a day.
But I also seems like what I'm hearing is the social media, the TikTok generation kind of kicking into prayer, because you're talking about 10 minutes, short, sweet. That's the whole mentality of TikTok and little bite-sized pieces. And so you're almost having to change the presentation of prayer to meet the community's consumption of data or thought.
Meeting people where they are.
Yeah. And I don't mean that negative. It's just interesting that society might change how prayer is consumed.
At least at the beginning.
Yeah.
I think that it's challenging to ask people to come to, for example, we are right now, as we're recording this, we're a week away from Holy Week. And so we're going to have some really exceptional worship services during Holy Week that are only done once a year. And many of them are 90-minute services, maybe a little longer, and they're extraordinary and they're beautiful. If you have not been shaped, then you can't accept a 90-plus minute worship service without getting antsy. And that's okay, because we have hundreds of people who love that stuff. Great. There are thousands of people in the church, though, who they're not ready for that kind of experience. They have to start somewhere. And so 10 minutes a day is a great starting place. And I don't begrudge anyone who needs to start there.
So if we take that point, then do we need Cliff Note versions of the Bible and of your sermon and to make it short and sweet?
I give people more credit than that.
Okay.
I think people have a bit more attention. That being said, I mean, I never preach more than 15 minutes. So it's, I graduated from seminary and I remember someone said,
on behalf of the church, can I say thank you?
Well, so that's exactly right. When I graduated seminary, I was told the shortest preacher will be the favorite preacher. And so, I try to be tight, and I do speak fast. So I probably say as many words as many others who might preach 25 or 30 minutes, but I do want to make sure that I hold on to people's attention and then end before they've lost that attention, and then give them something that is easy to take home with them, because that little bite-sized idea that sticks for the week, that's the most important part of anything I say.
And given that, that's also why we keep this podcast to a 30, 35-minute area, and we've reached that. So, Chris, really appreciate you being here and talking about this very fascinating subject. The joy I have as a host of the podcast is talking about topics that I'm interested in, and this is something that I've thought about numerous times. So to get you to speak about it has been wonderful. So let's clear the table now. When a crisis hits your world, will prayer open the door, or will it just be a refuge that you go and hide in? There's so many questions about that, about praying deeply, creating a habit, generating something positive that comes out of it. Hopefully through this podcast, you've been able to hear a perspective that might cause you to all of a sudden take the initiative to pray or teach your child to pray. And if so, then I think it's been a very positive 30 minutes. So with that, thank you for joining us at the Grown Up Table, and if you like it, hope you let other people know about it, to follow it or to click it so that we get more follows. Thank you very much.